Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Today we're joined by State Senator Joe Simitian, and I know there's a lot to talk about. Joe, thanks for being on Democratic Television.
Good to see you again.
Well, there is a lot to talk
Yeah.
about. We're transitioning from, on a national level, a Bush administration to an Obama administration.
Right.
I think the air is full of hope. That's exciting. But we're not in Washington. We're in California. We're in a state with a lot of problems.
I absolutely agree. I think I don't recall a time like this one where there was so much sort of hope and enthusiasm and yet so much anxiety at the same time here in California. I think the election has just been a breath of fresh air. I think people have a sense of optimism that we haven't seen for a long time, belief and participation in the process that we haven't seen for a long time, which I find very encouraging. And yet here in California, very difficult economic scene, which is shared across the country, and then our own budget crunch here in California, which is just a source of ongoing concern and has real impacts on people's daily lives here in California and in Santa Clara County. So it's a tough time, and yet, it's nice that the people have some sense of optimism and are ready to put their shoulder to the wheel, I think.
Well, no concern or anything, but I put a lot of expectation on you. You've served in local government, school, county, assembly, now the state senate. I hope that there's others with that kind of background to try to tackle this.
It's interesting. It does make a difference. I had a young assembly fellow when I was a brand new member of the state legislature, part of our program to bring young people into public service. And I asked him after he'd been in the Capitol for a couple of months, what have you learned in your 2 months here? And he said, I've learned that it matters where you were before you got here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when you're talking about issues with folks from the city about what they're trying to do in the neighborhoods, the fact that you were a local mayor means you have some insight of that. When you're talking to folks about school board issues and how we can improve things in the schools, the fact that you spent time on a school board makes it, and on private sector issues, the fact that I spent 20 years in the private sector. So it does matter. I found that, when you get there, particularly with term limits, you don't have the decades in service that people used to have to try and get inside some of these issues. And, there's still a lot of things that you have to learn when you get there, but the service before you get there does make a difference, and I think gives you a feel for how the decisions we make in Sacramento play out, back here at home on the ground.
Well, not only have you served in other levels, you grew up in this community. You're a Palo Alton, you graduated from Palo Alto High School, and so you must bump into folks at all levels.
No, and it's really throughout the county. I find, for a place with 1.8 million people, it's a small county. Our family bought its first home on Blaney Avenue in what was then Cupertino. Actually, it was then San Jose. It got de-annexed and re-annexed into Cupertino. But people said, I got asked at a business event, what was your first entrepreneurial experience? And the whole place broke out laughing because they said the lemonade stand on Blaney Avenue. The houses were going up across the street. The orchards had just come down, and I understood then what it meant to have a captive market because there was no place else they could go for lemonade back in the late 50s when the valley was sort of becoming the place it's become today. But from one end of the county to the other, when you've served in local government, means you have those relationships. The people know who you are. They feel comfortable picking up the phone to call and say, we've got a problem. And so pretty much really on a countywide basis, those relationships are there, and that helps me do a better job for the folks in our district. And as you know, as California has grown, our state senate districts have grown. So each one of us now has about 950,000 people. Tremendous breadth of 13 different communities in my district, and it's great. I love the variety, but it's a challenging time. I know from talking to folks in the cities and school districts and businesses throughout my district.
Well, you mentioned the number 13, and I want to segue. Speaking of Prop 13, the state has really struggled to find the funds to provide services at all levels. I know you were helpful in trying to bring some sanity to the Prop 13 discussion. We lost that, and now I think probably in all your levels of government you've had to deal with less.
Well, at the state level, I think what's frustrating is that we really do have a very hard line Republican attitude about the need for new revenues. And it's hard for a lot of us in Santa Clara County who remember the day and age when we had a somewhat more moderate group of Republicans that were serving in Sacramento. That day has come and gone. And so in the state Senate, we have 15 Republicans, and every single one of them has taken a no taxes pledge. So they've signed a statement that says, I will oppose and vote against any and all tax increases. So that means whether or not there's a state emergency or whether we're in dire straits as we are today, whether or not people are willing to make significant cuts, they've just said no. And same story in the state assembly. And at some point, we just sort of have to take these folks at their word that they mean what they say, and as unreasonable as it is to you and to me, and I think to any objective observer who, it's not that hard really to understand what you need to do. You need to spend less, collect more, and do it now. You do that, and we can get out of this. You don't, and it's just going to get worse and worse, and that's what's happened. So, we're going to have to start thinking about how do we do this without the help of our Republican colleagues, because they're just not going to get there, I'm afraid.
Well, and the issue of a 2/3 vote necessary to take on the budget, to alter it, has to come up again and again.
Yeah, and as you know, I think that, we're one of just 3 states here in California. We're one of just 3 states that has a 2/3 requirement for a budget. The other 2 being Arkansas and Rhode Island. And in those states, Democrats have 2/3 majorities in both houses of the legislature, which means that California is really the only state in the country that is perennially held hostage to a budget vote where literally a handful of folks on the other side of the aisle can say, we're not going to go there, and there's not a thing you can do to make us.
I don't want to sound naive, but most people who run for the legislature have served in other capacities. They worked their way up. They've dealt with budgets. They know how important the flow is. Is there some way to get people to realize taking that kind of pledge is so deleterious to everything that we stand for?
I don't think so. Steve, I've been in the legislature since 2001. We've had that first year we were in fairly good shape, but really every year since we've had a sort of a challenge with the budget, a budget roller coaster. It goes back to some of the decisions in the late 90s to both grow the budget but also to eliminate revenues. So once things got a little sour in the economy, we were in the worst of both worlds. We had increased expenditures for things that you and I and the public value, education, health care for folks who need it, but we had given away all of those revenues that supported that. So now we're stuck, and this is not a new conversation we're trying to have with our Republican colleagues. Year after year after year, just a month or so ago, my Democratic colleagues and I walked onto the floor of the Senate and said, we're going to vote for $8.5 billion in budget cuts on things we care about: health care, welfare, education, higher education. But we want $8.5 billion worth of increased revenues to try and balance one with the other. We couldn't get a single Republican vote for that balanced approach. And so, as I say, I think anybody with, an ounce of common sense can tell that you have to do both. You have to reduce your expenditures, you have to increase your revenues. But for these folks, it's a hard line, ideological line in the sand that they just won't cross. And we're going to have to figure out how to do something about that 2/3 requirement, or how to find new revenues to balance the cuts without a 2/3 vote. If we can find fees that don't require a 2/3 vote, then unfortunately that's the path we're going to have to take.
Well, the other point that's worth mentioning is the Republican governor agrees with you.
Well, that's right. And so it's been, it's been the oddest of experiences over these last 5 years now to watch the Republican governor who can't bring his Republican legislative colleagues along. Who among us would have imagined 5 years ago after the recall that the Republican governor was going to mount a call for tax increases? That he was absolutely positively clear about that's not going to happen. And even he now has come to the conclusion that, again, you have to spend less, collect more, and take action sooner rather than later. But he not only can't bring his Republican colleagues along, but the Senate Republican leader actually stormed out of a meeting in the governor's office the other day and said, not worth working with this governor, or I'm just going to keep working with my legislative colleagues. So it's an upside down world from a partisan standpoint when you start talking about the Republican Party in Sacramento.
So meanwhile, you will be in session and deal with issues. You chair the Natural Energy.
I chair the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and then the corresponding committee on the budget side, which is the Resources Committee, which is where those budget decisions get made about environmental issues. New assignment for me. Most of my budget experience over the last 8 years has been on the education scene.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be a challenge, because one of the things that our Republican colleagues are saying is, well, we might look at some new revenues, maybe someday, But first, we have to have some reforms, as they refer to them, which basically mean gutting California's environmental protection laws. And that's just a place that I'm not prepared to go, and I don't think my constituents would want me to go. But that's the debate we're having right now, and I expect it'll be a continued source of conversation over the coming year.
Well, this is California, and Californians, I think, really do want the environment, our oceans, our mountains, all that respected.
Well, exactly, and I think people, I'm fortunate. The constituency I represent in Santa Clara County is well educated, engaged, informed, active. No one in my district has ever said, "Gee, I think the air's too clean," or we ought to roll back the protections against particulate matter in the air. And yet, again, on the partisan level in Sacramento, I've got Republican colleagues who just recently have said, you know what, we think the emission standards are too tough. We ought to slow down, roll them back, and if there are health consequences, gee, that's just too bad. And I just, it's a conversation that would be impossible to imagine, frankly, having in Santa Clara County.
Now, the Senate recently decided to select a new leader,
Right.
Darrell Steinberg, and I understand you feel good about him.
I do.
Leadership.
Darrell actually has some Bay Area ties. He grew up in Millbrae as a kid, and he's obviously an adroit political personality. If he ended up as our president pro tem in the Senate, but he's a guy who really cares deeply about the underlying policy issues and the work we do. And best example I can give you is last year I did a bill that was important but a little bit wonky on education data. I believe strongly that unless we have a system that allows us to figure out what's working and what's not, what's serving kids, what doesn't, we're never going to get the job done. So I'm off working on that. And Senator Steinberg was my joint author. He was the second banana, if you will, on my bill. And when people say, what can you tell me about Darrell, I can say, here's a guy who is going to be the president pro tem of the Senate who says, this is an important policy issue and I want to be the Me Too on it if that's helpful in terms of moving the bill along. And, literally had his hands all over the policy issues and understood why what to many people I'm sure seemed like a pretty obscure issue had all the impact in the world. And he's right there on the importance of education issues. We're losing, 20 to 25% of these kids, Steve, who are dropping out every year. And even if that's not your kid, we can't afford that in California. If we're going to be competitive on a national and international level, if we're going to fill the high-wage, high-skilled jobs, if we're going to attract those industries and those jobs and those tax revenues, we got to have a talent pool, a workforce that's ready to fill those jobs. And Darrell gets that. So both, as Democrats, we care about giving people opportunity, but we also care about providing jobs as part of that opportunity.
Right.
And he gets that in a big way. And I just think it's going to be really a very good year with his leadership.
Great. We're going to take a little break.
Okay.
When we come back, we'll talk some more.
Good.
Welcome back to Democratic Television and our guest, State Senator Joe Simitian. Right. Joe, real excited about the enthusiasm that's out there now with the election of former Senator Obama. I think 75% of Americans that are polled say they think he's going to do a good job. That's clearly more than the number of people that voted for him. So we may be in an era of change, and can we get that going?
Well, I think that reflects a willingness on the part of the American public right now to give somebody who they think is decent and earnest and sincere the benefit of the doubt. They may have voted for the Republican candidate in the race, Senator McCain, but that's over, it's done. And I think a lot of that has to do, frankly, with the way that President-elect Obama framed his race. He talked about trying to create a new kind of politics, about a new way of doing business in the public's interest. And I think that's very appealing to people and has taken hold, and it's consistent with what I've heard and seen over the years in the area that I represent. And it's, for years it's been sort of fashionable to say people are apathetic or they're disillusioned or they're cynical. Frankly, that's never been my experience in the district that I represent. And we do the Ought to Be a Law contest every year. And here again this year, we've got more than 200 folks who had a particular idea for legislation that they wanted to propose through this annual opportunity that we provide.
So tell us a little bit more about the mechanics. People say...
Well, it happened the first year I was in Sacramento. I suddenly realized I was 120 miles away from my home, and I wasn't going to bump into people at the grocery store the way I used. I used to be, you go shopping at 10:30 at night, you think, okay, the day's pretty much over, and you bump into somebody in the produce section, and they've got a thing they want to talk to you about if you're the mayor, and you bump into somebody in the frozen food section. An hour later, you're over in the deli section. But you've taken care of 3 pieces of business, right? Obviously, when your district is larger, and now these Senate districts, as I say, 950,000 people, and you're 120 miles away from home 4 days a week, 8 months a year. So at the end of the first year, I came back and said, we got to find a way to get our folks engaged in the process. Let's give everybody in the area an opportunity to suggest legislation, invite that, if you will, not just allow it, but invite it. And so we created the contest. It's called There Ought to Be a Law. And every year, literally hundreds of folks from the area say, we think there ought to be a law. Here's our suggestion. And in the last 7 years, we've had 14 pieces of legislation that were proposed by my constituents, contest winners, and they've come to the Capitol, they've testified on their bills. Many of them have actually gone office to office to lobby their bills, and those 14 proposals have been signed into law by the governor of California, both Governor Davis and now Governor Schwarzenegger, and those law, and I think the people I talked to who've been part of it are just amazed that at the beginning of the year, they can have a good idea, and at the end of the year, it's law for 38 million Californians. So it's, empowerment is sort of an airy concept to toss around, but it's very real for the people who said, there ought to be a law. Beginning of the year they had the idea, end of the year it's law. And that's, so, we have great participation year after year. When I do sidewalk office hours, which is something that I think it's important to do, and we do them throughout the district, and it's just...
Are they just what they sound like?
They are, and I have a particular, one of the things I found though is, if you're going to set up a card table and an easel that says, welcome State Senator Joe Simitian, that farmers markets are the best bet. Almost no one's in a bad mood at the farmers market. And we have people who come specifically because we've put the word out and that they come specifically to chat with me and my staff, or we get a lot of folks who just wander by. But I think people ought to be able to walk up to you sort of nose to nose and say, tell me why you voted for this, or how come this isn't happening, or what about, and there's no screen, there's no filter, there's no appointment. It's just, and
you put the word out, you publicized it.
We do inserts in the papers, we do the press release. But what's interesting is I hear from people all the time who say, maybe we'll get 50 people who'll come on a Sunday morning and, queue up and we'll talk. But then, there are 50,000 other people in that particular community, whatever it may be, on a given Saturday or Sunday, who say, well, I've never been, but it matters to me, and I appreciate the fact that I know I could come if I had something I wanted to talk to you about. And, we do the traditional town halls, which I still like to do because they, a little more comfortable. We're not standing there on the corner, and people can engage a little more fully. And, this past fall, we did Campbell, Cupertino, Willow Glen, more than 100 folks in each venue. We encourage a lot of students to come because, and I think that's, back to the Obama campaign at the national level. My view, we put the word out to the social studies teachers, and the kids come, and I sort of tease them because I know some of them are there because they have to be, and some of them are there because they get extra credit. I'm very big on extra credit. I'm pro extra credit. That's my. So the town halls, the sidewalk office hours, the Ought to Be a Law. We do an education update a couple times a year so that folks who are particularly concerned about education issues can sort of focus in on those issues with me in my office, and it very. Santa Cruz, the ice cream social has become the annual way. I can see you're looking at me like no, it's free ice cream. That's a draw. The senator may be a draw, but the free ice cream is a bigger draw. And so we have a local ice cream shop in Santa Cruz over the hill, Mary Ann's. They're sort of a local institution, and people come with their folders and their loose leaf binders, and my whole staff from Sacramento comes down, and that way we can put names and faces together. And if you give people, in my experience, if we give people the opportunity to participate in a way that's meaningful, they are hungry for that. And I think the Obama campaign tapped into the same experience that I've had in my experience at the state and local level. So.
Have you talked to your colleagues about some of these ideas, proselytize even, to let them know?
Yeah, and different.
It's well received.
Different members have different reactions, and some of these are. I mean, the ought to be a law is a lot of work. I mean, the promise I made the first year was that I would personally review every single application. And do I have staff that helps? Of course. And do they do the research? Absolutely. And without them, I'd be able to give only cursory review. But it seemed to me if I was going to invite people to send me their ideas, I owed it. Now, that was before I knew that we'd have 250 proposals every year. But so now it's a sort of we laugh at home. It's a ritual. I have my stack of black binders, and I curl up by the fireplace in the easy chair, and I'm going through proposals. And the other thing I would say is that people I think have figured out is even if their idea doesn't get picked for ought to be a law, I am more informed about the issue they're concerned about, and that is information that I take with me on the floor of the Senate every day when I go to do, and that happens. There'll be a bill that'll suddenly be before me in committee or on the floor of the Senate, and I'll say, oh yeah, I know about that. I had a proposal about that a year or two ago. And again, Steve, people, I credit this national campaign with tapping into something that I felt very strong, which is that if it's real, people will protect. We did. I had folks who came to me about a spay and neuter bill. Now, on the national or international scene, that may not seem the biggest issue to a lot of folks, but it was clear to me from sidewalk office hours that people cared about a piece of legislation that was pending. I said, let's have a town hall in my district, a public forum on this, invite people to come for a Saturday morning. 300 people showed up, 4.5 hours.
Were they for and against?
Absolutely. And 4.5 hours of testimony, 94 people spoke. And the irony is the reason people wanted to talk to me was the bill was headed to a committee I sat on, and ultimately the bill went to a different committee. But I knew more about that issue than I had ever thought I was going to in this lifetime, and people had an opportunity to be heard, and they were hungry for it, and they were appreciative of the fact that we did it. And my view is we need to, we do that digitally with the website, we do that in a host of other ways, but people want to be connected and want to have a voice, and if we give it to them, they will take it. So
you're fairly optimistic about letting people have the opportunity to participate.
Yeah.
They really are hungry.
Absolutely.
We saw that with Obama. The issues that Obama raised were done, I think, in a real positive way. We can do it. Yes, we can. The issues that the state is facing seem so daunting.
But Cal, look, both certainly here in our valley and the state itself. I mean, we've found a way to adapt. I mean, I mentioned earlier growing up here as a kid, and so if you've been in the valley long enough, you've seen the transition from ag to aerospace to chips to PCs to .com, now clean tech, green tech, nanotech. I mean, that's how you survive. You adapt, you grow, and the state has the ability to do that again and again if we would just sort of put our minds to that task. And I continue to believe that public education is the key. It's the way we provide real opportunity. I mean, we say we're a society of equal opportunity. Well, that's either real or not, depending on whether or not we give kids the kind of education they need to make the most out of their lives. We say we want to grow the economy in Santa Clara County, but if we don't have first-rate schools and first-rate universities and colleges to go with it, then that's not going to happen.
And I know you also include community colleges.
Absolutely, and the community colleges, and this is, we talked earlier about sort of where you've been shapes your view. I mean, the community colleges get asked to do 3 different things, and in Santa Clara County, we've got community colleges doing 3 things very well. They're training kids for the next young adults for the next academic step. They are key in terms of job training and retraining. And when I was on the board of supervisors and we were trying to deal with welfare reform, move people from welfare to work,
right.
The community colleges really saved us in that very challenging time. And then lifelong learning. And some people sort of dismiss the lifelong learning piece, but my view is if the world's changing faster and faster and we're all going to grow older and older and people are living longer and longer, if ever there was a time when lifelong learning was key, it's now. So community colleges are doing that. But if we step away from that, then we can't be surprised that we don't see that opportunity. I think, I'm hoping we can tap into this sort of surge of enthusiasm on the national level and refocus it here on state and local issues in Santa Clara County. I think that that's possible. And I think people see, we're never going to compete abroad based on numbers. What we're going to have to do if we're going to be at the forefront of the knowledge economy is make sure that we have the best educated, cutting edge minds working on these problems. That's what will make us competitive in the Valley.
Right. Well, we have about a minute left.
Sure.
You spend time going into classrooms and talking to young people, to kids, to real kids.
Yeah.
What do you get out of that?
Well,
What do you think they get out of that?
I ask, how many of you are interested in politics? And maybe one poor kid in the back starts to raise his hand and then looks embarrassed and puts his hand down. So then what I say is, wait a minute, let me try it again. How many of you care about how good your teacher is, how long you're in class today, whether or not there's a spot for you at your community college, CSU, or UC, whether or not the tuition's going to be affordable, whether there'll be a job for you when you get out of school, whether or not there's going to be an affordable place to live, or you're going to spend the next 20 years living with your folks because you can't rent an apartment. And then how many of you care about, and every hand in the room goes up.
Yeah.
And what I say to them is, then you do care about politics, you just call it by a different name, and that's why you need to be engaged, because these are the things that shape your lives on a daily basis. These decisions get made in our state capitol, they get made at the local level.
Right.
Get connected now, because all of that is going to be a function of whether or not you have a voice in the way that's done.
Joe, I'm glad you're in office.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Democratic Television. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website, www.sccdp.org. Help make a difference, and we'll see you on the campaign trail.